Thanks very much, Megan, and welcome everyone tonight. It's a pleasure for me to be here. I love talking about some of the things that are going on in the city, and really my aim tonight is quite simple in one way. It's to try and give people a better understanding of what's going on so that when we have discussions as a community, we can do that in a more informed manner, and that's the key part of it. And really interesting tonight, I'm more nervous than I was last week because population is actually quite a complex issue. There are a lot of interacting factors that impact on how a population grows and how its future is determined. So I'm going to unpack all of that tonight. Let me just push the button. I better not push this one because this will turn the TV off. That would be not very good. You can see I'm nervous because I picked up the wrong clicker. I put this slide up last week because what you tend to get when you have presentations is people will come and they will tell you a story, and there's always an agenda. So the government will have an agenda, industry will have an agenda, even individual businesses have an agenda, and what they'll do is they'll pick a little bit of data over a time period to tell the story that they want to tell and that they think that they want you to hear. So tonight I'm not making it up. I'm using ABS data. I'm not cherry picking the data. I'm trying to present data over an extended period of time. Generally it'll be 10-year time frames. And I'm using Economy ID. I'm using data from the Regional Development Australia Population Symposium, which was just held in June this year, which was another opportunity to talk about population with the community. I'm going to talk a little bit about the state government data that's available on their population projections. We did a lot of work with the Population Task Force looking at the background data on population for the region and the city, and we're also going to refer to the Key Directions report, which was undertaken by the National Institute of Economic and Industry Research. So they did one of the largest unpackings of the data, economic data and population data for the north of the state in 25 years. So it is pretty robust, and I offer you the opportunity to check all this out at some point in time down the future. So the story tonight is what is population growth and what drives it. I want to give you some of the Australian and Tasmanian and Launceston population story. So it'll be a cascading story from the nation back down to our shores here on the Tamar River. There'll be some regional background which I think is important and impacts on it. It's a short story of economic context in Launceston. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the Population Task Force and what we might actually do, things that we can influence on an individual basis and as a community. It's a story of 20 toes told in 20 minutes. It'll be a bit longer than that. So the Australian, Tasmanian and Launceston population story, I'm going to start with just a few comments about fertility in Australia and about overseas migration in Australia, and then talk about the Tassie population and Launceston. I've got some data on the Australian fertility rates from 1976 to 2014. It's getting a little bit old, but it does actually give you a picture of what's been going on in this nation. So what you can see is that this dotted line here is the fertility rate, the number of kids people have per couple, and it's been on a declining trend and pretty much dead flat down to about here. So for about 20 years, since 1985, it's remained pretty much unchanged. And then in 2006, there's been this blip. The demographers predicted it would just continue to decline, but there's been this blip. And significant number of increase in births, and that, of course, indicates your fertility rate's gone up. About 350,000 extra kids have been born since 2006 in that 7-year period. There's a reason for that, which I'll come to in a minute. This is a slide that just shows who's coming to Australia to stay. And prior to 1996, most of the people that came to Australia were from the UK and from Italy and from Vietnam. And you can see these blue bars. The blue bar here is the United Kingdom, and the light blue bar is Italy. And just towards the end of that migration period, there are a few people coming through from Vietnam. But since 1996, there's been a dramatic shift in that. And particularly since 2006, we've had significant inward migration from people who come from India and China. Really significantly big jumps, 300,000 people between the 10-year period from 2006 to 2016 from China and India. And less so from Italy and some of the European countries. So they're coming from different places, but there's still a lot of people migrating to Australia. So we'll have a bit of a look at that. So between 1976 and 2006, we find that migrations moved in cycles that are probably largely related to the business cycle. But since 1995, which is here, it really hasn't been much below 100,000 people coming permanently to settle in Australia per year. And then at the GFC in 2007-08, it really spiked up to around 200 to 250,000. And that's had a really big impact on the Australian population growth, and it's mainly Melbourne and Sydney that are being impacted by that. To get a sense of that, that's about half of the population of Tassie every year coming into Australia for the last 7 or 8 years. And reading in the newspaper yesterday, it might have been today, there was a report from the ABC saying the federal government is expecting that Sydney will grow by 1.5 million people over the next 17 years. And they recognise it's a problem or a challenge to manage that, but they don't really have a way of dealing with that. So you've got to work on how you manage that as best you can. But this population growth is really in the bigger cities. The recent immigration that we've seen in Australia has got some impacts. The demographers really thought what we were going to have is a bulge in baby boomers, this group here, 55 to 69, 70. So this is some data from 2001 to 2011, but they could see this bulge in baby boomers gradually moving through into old age. But what's actually happened is with this overseas migration that's happened over the last 8 or 9 years since the global financial crisis, you've got this kick up in population here of young families coming in from overseas. And what do the young families do? They have babies. So there's another spike of babies. So they reckon that instead of having this big bulge in baby boomers move through, we've actually got 3 population peaks. And the guys from ID reckon that business people should be paying attention to developing services for these different bulges in population that we've now got coming through in our country. So I'll leave the national story and I'll talk a little bit about what determines the Tasmanian population. It's always related to births, how many deaths, how many people move and how long they stay. They're the 3 or 4 things that really impact it. Birth control, you could end up with an unloved child like this. Anyway, birth trends in perspective. My story, I'm one of 6 kids. My great-grandmother had 12 and my great-great-grandmother had 22. So the performance of the girls today is quite different. We're having less kids, we're having later pregnancies, like the average age of Tassie mums having their first child has increased to 29.8 years versus the Australian average of 31. Less babies, the average mum's having 2 children versus the Australian average of 1.8. And just to note, our replacement rate for population is about 2.1. So we're actually having less children than there are to actually replace the existing population in the country. So that would indicate we've got a decline in fertility, and the statistics would show you that Tassie's natural population growth has actually been in decline for a long time, since 1981-82. Another population driver is deaths. So the life expectancy in Tasmania is the 2nd lowest in Australia. It is 83 years for women and 79 for men, but it's increasing. It's gone up nearly a year for women over the last decade and 1.6 years for men. And then we have migration. And what happens with migration is you move if you have to, where there's a conflict, if food and water are scarce, or if there's a policy or directive where you have to move. And then you also have this opportunity to move if you want to. to improve your opportunity, your family future, your lifestyle. And for the people that do move, if they stay longer, the population grows. Your mum drives me crazy, fine we move. And that's how human migration got started. My mother-in-law lives in Melbourne. And I hope she never sees this YouTube clip. Tasmanian population growth data. Lisa Denny produced this in the symposium that was held middle of the year. And basically what it says is that this is the number of people in Tasmania, and this is time, and you can see that the population is growing consistently. There's a little bit of a flat spot here, and that flat spot is shown by the red line, shows you the population growth rate. So this population flattened off here, so the growth rate dipped, but it's always been above zero for Tassie, and the most recent growth is heading up towards 1.2%. But it's different in Launceston and the north, and it's different in the northwest of Tassie. So that's a state perspective. If you look at the state perspective and the components of population change, on the left-hand side we've got the actual numbers of population change, and on the right-hand axis you've got the percentage growth rate. This only applies to the blue line, the growth rate. The other ones apply to actual numbers of people. So you can see that the population natural increase in Tasmania has been sort of tracking around 2000, has dipped down a little bit since 2003. You can see that the overseas migration has gradually crept up, and you can see the net interstate migration is all over the place like a dog's breakfast. And interstate migration is we've actually had 1,000 people leave, near on 2,000 people leave, another 800 and 800 on a statewide basis. So the interstate migration is quite flexible and moves around quite a lot. If you look at population growth in northern Tasmania, the state government predicts it's going to be very, very low. They came out with population projections in April this year, and they basically forecast that in northern Tasmania the population will grow by about 3,168 over the next 25 years, which is 0.1%, and it's one of the lowest growth rates in Australia. And you can see that line there. This is the number of persons, this is time out to 2042, and this is Launceston. So they reckon the net Launceston in the northeast, so the north of the state, will grow by about 3,000. The west and the northwest will decline by about 6,000, and Hobart's going to grow by 49,000 over the next 25 years, which is 0.7% growth rate. That's 2,000 a year pouring into Hobart for the next 25 years. And I made this point the other night. Where's the state government going to have to focus their attention? It's going to be in Hobart, because I'm guaranteeing there might be someone in the room tonight who says, you know, what is the government thinking? They've lost the plot. We don't need any more population. You know, why are you doing this? And so this is going to put pressure, if their prediction is correct, on Hobart. The state government has also come out with projected local government area population changes to 2042. So this is those other figures broken down by each individual municipality. But you can see the ones that have got the growth. It's Hobart, Clarence, Glenorchy, Kingborough, Brighton, Sorell, Huon Valley. Then you've got a couple here, West Tamar and Launceston. And then you start getting to a point where these communities are going to decline in population. Meander Valley, Dorset. So about 15 of our 29 local government areas are predicted to have negative growth over the next 25 years. There's going to be an increase of 6,655 in Launceston and West Tamar and Flinders Island, but there's going to be a decrease of 3,048 in Georgetown, Breakaday, Dorset, Meander Valley. So our net growth is about 3,168, which I referred to a little bit earlier. I want to talk a little bit about, I'm shifting gears away from population a bit, just talking a little bit about some of the background work that's been done on population in the north of the state. In 2016, the Northern Tasmanian Development Corporation, they set some goals. In 2018, they released a report, the Key Directions Report, which was prepared by the National Institute of Economics and Industry Research. And in mid-2018, a Northern Tasmanian Population Task Force was established. At this age, we can't be coached. It's more likely you herd them in one direction and hope they get a ball in the goal. It's not quite like that, but what I'm saying to you is that there's been some significant work undertaken over the last 3 years, which helps frame an understanding of some of the things that impact population in the northern region. In 2016, Northern Tasmania Development Corporation set some goals, and they wanted to increase gross regional product by 50%. They wanted 8,000 new jobs and $100 a week in the pocket of workers across northern Tasmania on a weekly basis. The key finding out of the Key Directions Report showed that in northern Tasmania, our population will possibly grow by 3,000 over the next decade. So that's different to the state government. They're saying 3,300 or whatever it was over 25 years. But our working age population will decline by 5,000. And if you extrapolate that out to 2036, the working age population will decline by 12,000. So we've got some challenges in terms of having an adequate workforce, and it's the ageing population that's causing some of the challenges in this space. And they're saying that we may struggle to have a workforce to support our economy going into the future. You may say they've got it wrong, but the work that was presented by Ivan Neville from the federal government on market research, he's saying that in Tasmania in the next 5 years we're going to need 58,700 jobs filled. We don't have an obvious source of filling a lot of those positions in the state today. That's the total turnover of jobs, but he's saying there is a hole in the bucket, the same as the NIA's Key Direction Report. So there's a couple of directions this is coming from. So the Northern Population Task Force was formed, and that was chaired by Michael Stretton, a General Manager from the City of Launceston. And there were a number of stakeholders on that, with the Northern Tasmanian Development Corporation, the Office of Coordinator General, Regional Development Australia, the Chamber of Commerce, UTAS, councils and state government. We had a mayor, the Mayor of Georgetown was also involved in that. And the role was really to review the population data and to develop a strategy to support population growth. So what I want to do is just have a look at the economy and how it impacts on population in the north and in Launceston. And we'll start with gross regional product, jobs, unemployment, and which industries are growing and the demand for their labour. The gross regional product, we're up here about $4.5 billion, $4.5 billion. That's the wealth that we're generating by our businesses and our organisations in the region. But you can see that it's been pretty flat since 2010, and you can see that it's even dipped in 2018. It's dropped off 1.7%. So it's pretty flat. It's going up slowly, but it's pretty flat. The number of jobs over the past decade has increased a little. So this is the number of jobs. This is 40,000 jobs in the city. It's gone up and down a bit, but today there are 1,047 more jobs than there were in 2007-08. So that's come up a little bit. If you look at unemployment, we see in the City of Launceston, for an extended period, we've had unemployment around 7 to 9%. This is 7, and that's 9. The green line is the City of Launceston. They've taken this. I must have cut the... Oh no, it's up here. Sorry. Greater Hobart is this one. Tasmania is this one, and Australia is the darker green line. So our unemployment's been consistently higher than Hobart and Australia, and we've got fairly high youth unemployment, ranging around 16 to 19% over that period. So my summary of that is things are chugging along. We've got some job growth. We've got very little change in gross regional product. We've got some high unemployment. But that's, to me, it's hiding some things that sit under the economy. So if you have a look at the demand for labour, and this is in what you call full-time equivalents. So I work for council, I work full-time, so I'm a full-time equivalent of labour. Megan works 2 days a week. Luke works, who knows, 3 days a week tonight. So if you put Luke 3 days a week and Megan 2 days a week together, they're equivalent of one full-time labour unit. So what I'm interested in here is to look at where the shifts have been in the use of labour in the city. And to make it easy, I've said if there's been a change of around 300, I've highlighted it. If it's been less than, if the demand for labour's dropped by more than 300, I've highlighted it in red. And if it's increased by more than 300, I've highlighted it in green, just so you can pick out the main things that are changing. So agriculture has declined by 299, I rounded that up to 300. Manufacturing has declined by 1,211. Wholesale trade, 883. Financial services, 384. Administrative and support services, 374. And in total, we've lost 1,526 FTEs in the city over the last decade. And we've had this massive increase in FTEs in healthcare and social assistance. And most of that has actually happened in the last 2 years. 900 FTE increase in that sector just in the last 2 years. It's your ageing demographic kicking in. That's the challenge there. So what this tells you is that we've got more jobs, but we've actually got less labour doing it, and that means we've got more part-time work. And most of that part-time work is more temporary and is lower paid. So we know the economy is a critical driver of population growth. When an economy declines, the population declines. When an economy is flat, the population will probably be flat. And young, productive working families are the most impacted, and they all tend to leave. How has the economy affected the population in Launceston? Well, it pretty much reflects what the population's been doing over the last decade. So today we've got 67,449 estimated resident population in the city, and that's been pretty much flat for a decade. So what did the Population Task Force do? We spent some time, we looked at the literature on what the drivers are for population. We reviewed the Australian and international methods to grow population. We reviewed the population demographics and the migration trends. And we prepared a strategy and handed this to NTDC for region-wide implementation in April 2019. So what we found is that we've got, of the 50 largest cities in Australia, we've got the 5th lowest growth rate. During 2011 to 2007, the net population grew by just 27, which is just a classroom, basically. Last year the population was 600, which is great. So we've moved out of a phase where population was flat or declining, and we seem to have stemmed out migration, and we have maintained our humanitarian migration, and we've increased population with the number of UTAS students that are studying here in the city, which is all good. But the challenge with this is that compared to other cities, we're losing competitiveness. So if you look at Launceston, this is population here, and where we were in 2007, this is our population. And if you look at Ballarat, Bendigo, Albury-Wodonga, Bendigo, for instance, was a smaller city than Launceston a decade ago, and today they've got 10,000 more residents. So they're adding 1,000 people a year. These cities are growing at between 1.2 and 1.8% per annum. And that puts what's happening in Hobart in some context, because Hobart's just moved back into a growth rate of about 1.2%, but these cities are doing this year after year for a decade. So the growth that's being experienced in Hobart is actually pretty normal for a regional city in Australia. We're just not ready for it, if that makes sense. So although the population's stagnant, the demographics are really swinging around. Between 2006 and 16, we've had 3,600 people aged above 50 years. That's a 5.3% increase, and it's now 37% of our population. We've had an increase in 1,429 humanitarian migrants. We've had an increase of 1,072 people needing assistance with core activities. That's a 34% increase. And now it's 6.4% of our population. And we've had a net loss of 1,204 people that are in the working age and young families bracket. So we're getting older, we're less able, we're less skilled, and we're less economically competitive. You can see the graph here, the surge in the number of people in the 60 to 69 and 70 to 84 bracket, and the decline in the 35 to 49 and 12 to 17 brackets here, which are the young productive families. The other thing we found, which I thought was really interesting, because I thought people pretty much are stable, they hang around. But in fact, in the City of Launceston, 38% of our residents, that's over 25,000 people in the city, change their address at least once every 5 years in the census period. And that's not abnormal, because it's 40% on average for Australia. So as a community, we tend to move around quite a lot. And this only indicates one change. So anyone who's moved twice in that period would only show up as one change in residence. So let's have a look at, I unpacked a lot of data. So it's hard to know which bits to pull out. But what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about movements between states and other states, and I'm going to have a look at movements in some of the age groups in Launceston. So this is a table, and what I've done is Tassie's in the yellow, and this will be consistent in the tables that come forward. And it shows you here that our in-migration here, 6,685 for the City of Launceston. We've had 6,685 come in from Tasmania. We've had 629 go out to Tasmania. So we've actually had a net positive in-migration from the rest of Tasmania into the city. But we're having these trends here if we've got in-migration from Victoria of 887, but we're having out-migration of 1,063. So we're losing 716 to Victoria, 479 to Queensland, etc. So we have in-migration from New South Wales and the rest of Tasmania, and all the other states, we've got a net out-migration going from the City of Launceston elsewhere. This is a bit hard to read, but what I was trying to do when I was unpacking this data was get an understanding. Is there somewhere that people are coming to the city that's consistent, and we've got a net in-migration in, and can we target them and get more of them to come? Was sort of my naive thinking on this. So I started to do some work on that, and this is a table that looks at migration between the City of Launceston and other LGAs across Australia. And what I did to try and make it easy, I'm looking for lots of net migration inward or outward to our city. And what you can see is the net inward migration is coming from Dorset, Northern Midlands, Georgetown, Breakaday, Burnie, Devonport and Circular Head. So more than 50 people net over that 5-year last census period. It's coming from the region around the city. And the outward migration, the blue ones are mainland, so it's going to Port Phillip, Yarra, Brisbane, Sunshine, Melbourne and the Gold Coast. They're the main ones, but there's a lot going south, Kingborough, Clarence, Glenorchy, West Tamar and Hobart. So we've got these patterns of migration where people are coming in from the region around us into the city, and then they're moving to Hobart, or they're moving to some of these locations on the mainland. And then you've got this other stuff happening where there are some large migrations of people from some of the local government areas, like Meander Valley. We've got 1,306 come into the city over that 5-year period, but 1,263 from the city moved to the Meander Valley. So your net migration is actually pretty small. They're just coming and going. So we've got quite a lot come in from Townsville and go back to Townsville. I don't know whether the same people are going back, but you've got these flows that don't actually affect your population a lot, but they're There's significant numbers of people moving one way or another, but they're not having a net impact on your migration. So there's no real trend, basically, except for the one that I mentioned before, coming in from around the city and up the north, and then down to Hobart, and then across to the mainland to various places. And I broke up that same thinking into age brackets of people, so you can track the various age demographics and if there's differences in them. And I'm just presenting one of them. So these are people who are aged 25 to 34 years, and what they're doing, where they're moving between Launceston and local government areas across Australia in the last census period. So the only place we're getting net in-migration for that age bracket, 25 to 34 years, is from Georgetown, of any number. So we're talking more than 25 people net. And the net outward migration is again south, Hobart, Clarence. It's a little bit to Northern Midlands, Meander Valley and West Tamar, but Melbourne, Yarra and Gold Coast. There's no trend in this, so we're not going to be able to target a particular municipality on the mainland or in Tassie and actually draw people to the city with a strategic approach to growing our population. So the wrap up of all of that is that there's no silver bullets here. There's lots of other regions are having similar sorts of challenges. But we are a little bit of a canary in the Australian regional city population coal mine. Our natural population is in decline, and to maintain or grow our population we need in-migration or we need to reduce out-migration. So you've got to think about why people might want to live in Launceston, who settles here, why would they want to be here? People will come for work, so we need to focus on the economy, and people will come for lifestyle and retirement. And people will also come when they're part of migration programs, such as humanitarian migrants. The task force also found that there were some spillover effects that drive our population movements. So in places like Bendigo, Ballarat, Geelong, there's a spillover from the major city like Melbourne. And what tends to happen when you unpack that is that the people that are living on the Melbourne side that's adjacent to Ballarat will tend to migrate to Ballarat, but they won't go to Geelong. And the reasoning around that is that people like to maintain their social networks, they like to maintain their work networks, and that's the tendency of how you track those population movements. And what that would tell you is if you want to target population, you'd target ex-Tasmanians because they've got some roots here, they've got some family here, they've got some work connections here. If you're going to target any particular group, it's Tasmanians returning home that you'd have as your target, because we just don't have a natural spillover target of a big city. There's some real deal breakers in this though, and their employment, their health, their welcoming community, their lifestyle, their education. So we've got some challenges with employment. I heard Errol Stewart on the radio less than 2 weeks ago, and he made a comment which I thought was quite insightful but quite brutal in a way. He was asked where the AFL team should go in Tasmania. And he said, it's got to go to Hobart. And the interviewer on the ABC said, well, why is that? And he said, it's as simple as this. If you've got high-flying swans, and we're going to have the best high-flying swans to have the best AFL team, they will get a job with the team, wherever it is. But he said they're unlikely to be partnered with a goose that flies a bit lower. And so the high-flying partners with the high-flying swans need a job. And he said that actually what'll happen is Hobart's got more senior positions available than Launceston has. And if you want to have the most competitive team and don't have people coming and going, it has to go to Hobart. So his strategic logic around it was that we're not as competitive as Hobart on the job front, and we need to attract the best people here. And I thought that was a really interesting insight from someone who is clearly a Launceston person and wants this place to succeed, but he could see that was a challenge. So employment's a challenge, health is a challenge. We've got to get all the health woes in this state off the front page of the newspaper, because people will not come if they don't think they can be looked after when they get ill. I don't know quite how we do that. But I'll move on to a couple of things. So there's a couple of deal breakers in there that we need to do some work on. And those deal breakers are holes in the bucket. There's not a lot of point putting energy and time and resources to pour more people into a city if we're not serious about sorting out the deal breakers. Because the fact is if we could reduce the number of people that leave this city and the state by 25%, 1 in 4, we would meet all of our population targets without doing anything else. So we need to understand that it's not simply about rushing around getting more people in. We've got to plug some of these holes up so they find it attractive and want to stay. Whoops. If you talk to David Adams about this, he'll say, think about staying longer. Staying longer, you don't have to stay here forever, but if you have more people come here and they stay a bit longer, you've actually increased your population. So if we could increase student numbers with a population of revolving students that turns over every 2 to 3 years in the city, you would inject, let's say there was 2,000 come, we have some new programs. They get the Blue Economy CRC up and running, which will happen, which is great, and they do some more work around the Maritime Precinct and things like that. If we had an extra 2,000 students in here, your population go up by 2,000, and by the way, they'll inject about $40,000 a year at least into your city. So we have to get UTAS relocation to work for the city, because these things are right on our doorstep now, and they do actually shift the dial immediately on population, and they shift the dial immediately on the economy, and they bring skilled people in because they have to teach these courses. So I think we've got to think quite cleverly about what opportunities we've got here and how we grab them and make them work. There's other opportunities with growing business, trying to attract businesses here. And we've got Bede here, who could talk for much more than I can on this, but Bede and I have plotted for a number of years, and Bede's actually doing a bit about this. But it's partly about marketing what we've got, the things we have in this city here, and targeting small businesses to relocate. And to pilot, one of the pilot projects of the task force is to get this lifestylepreneur project up and running. People who can work anywhere in the world, who might be living in Melbourne or in Sydney, and they've got a 2-hour commute to their office, and they largely do stuff online anyway. They could come to this city and have much cheaper accommodation. They can have much cheaper business offices, and do everything they want from here with a much better lifestyle. So we need to sell that up and package it and put that as an opportunity. And the other thing is these are smaller businesses, but the Office of the Coordinator General is working day in and day out looking at bigger fish, and that's the space they've got to operate in, and it's not something for probably council to get too involved with, apart from collaborating and working and supporting that. But there are a number of players here who are doing their bit to shift the dial. To settle here, people also need to feel welcome, and this is a little bit touchy, and I've put a migrant slide there. But not all people are welcome in Launceston. We do see some active examples of discrimination, and you might have seen there's a bunch of articles in the Examiner just over the last month that highlighted this. And I think we just confront that head on and say we're going to fix it. We're going to work on educating our community about the value of humanitarian migrants and other migrants, and the fact that we need people to come here to grow our city and economy. To settle, people have to make a home. They need access to affordable housing in a neighbourhood where they're valued and support from the community. And I think we've largely got most of that in place, because our housing is actually quite competitive compared to most places in Australia. And to succeed, all people have to have meaningful work. This one's a bit of a sticking point, because without meaningful work, people just don't stay. And meaningful work and quality jobs is also critical. Meaningful work for both partners, the example I just gave that Errol Stewart raised. And we shouldn't accept an attitude that low-paid menial jobs should be standard expectation for meaningful work for a large number of people in our community. Love a duck. Has anyone heard of Love a Duck? The story of Love a Duck? Love a Duck's a classic because the Australian government was waxing lyrical about pushing people into regions and how important it is that people from the cities, because of the things I mentioned that are going on in Sydney, how that population would be really helpful if they could move some of it out into the regions. But there's a real reality check around it. And Love a Duck's a humanitarian migration story in Nil, Victoria, near Horsham. Love a Duck's the largest duck farm in the Southern Hemisphere. They process over 100,000 ducks a week in their peak production season. They are serious duck growers. And in a population of Nil of 2,184, there's just not enough local people, and it's an ageing population similar to our challenge, there's just not enough people to allow that business to expand. So the business decided that they would work with the local government there, the municipality, and with the community to see whether the community was prepared to support a significant influx of humanitarian migrants from Myanmar. And there's been 268 current people moved to Nil, and they've allowed that business to expand and grow. And they've put kids in schools, which has kept their schools open, and they're buying food from their supermarket, and they're growing food and doing other things. But it's all about meaningful work. These guys get paid real Australian wages to do real Australian jobs, and most of these people are from a rural background, so they get it, and they're good with the animals, and they're doing a really constructive thing. But be very wary when government says, oh, you know, we just need to move people out of Sydney into the regions, because if you can do that, they'll come and then they'll go, because there's got to be a meaningful reason for them to stay and participate. Just to provide some data on our humanitarian migrants here in Launceston, because we've had nearly 1,500 move here over the last decade, and you could perhaps imagine what our population growth would have been like if you'd pulled 1,500 people out of it and they hadn't arrived. Oh, this is one for you, Megan. We're asylum seekers heading for New Zealand. We've made room. We're Kiwis heading for Australia. But the interesting thing is that this only really began in 2001, and by 2006 we had a relatively large population of Sudanese here and people from Sierra Leone, but basically they've left. There's only 66 and 26 here now after the last census period. So 76% of Sierra Leone community have left and 57% of the Sudanese community have left. So the question is what are we doing with these people here? We've now got 431 from Bhutan and 300 from Nepal and 209 from Iran, etc. Are we going to be able to welcome into our community and be able to give them meaningful opportunities to find work and make a home and be productive in our community? And we can. This is controversial. This one's controversial. More than 40% of our jobs are never advertised. I reckon that's a problem. We've got highly skilled people who can't access our job market. I'll refer to Edward, who's here today. Edward works for the Northern Tasmanian Development Corporation, and one of his projects is to try and find pathways for skilled migrants, and these are people who've got very good skills, to actually find a way to get into a workplace. And it's really tough because 40% of our jobs aren't advertised. And I reckon if we want to be globally competitive and we don't want to slip down the competitive pole as a city, we've got to consider positioning our businesses with the best skilled and trained staff possible. So consider testing the market rather than calling your cousin. Because, no joke, they're one of the largest manufacturers in this state will not market test jobs. And I think they're missing out on the opportunity of some fantastic people. So we've got targets from Northern Tasmanian Development Corporation, you've got population task force targets, and then you've got some stretch targets that are based on investment attractiveness. So why are they different? And they're largely different because they've come from different places. The state government set some initial targets in 2015, and their goal was to have 650,000 people living in Tasmania by 2050. Now, their target for 2020 was 530,000, and they've reached that target almost 2 years ago. So they're a little bit ahead of their target. And their key pillars on this was job creation, workforce development, migration and livability. So they identified quite a number of years ago in 2015 that there were issues with population and that they needed to take some action and set some targets. So they're a little bit ahead of their target. The Population Task Force have set a target of 1.2% per annum, or 16,000 people over the next decade. That's about the same as Bendigo, Ballarat. And that'll mean that we'll have a population of 160,000 people in northern Tasmanian region by 2031. These are really quite ambitious, given where we are at the moment, where it's been flat for so long. But it's important that we do that and grow and keep competitive with some of the other cities. What are you laughing at, Megan? The solution for the ageing time bomb is to take up smoking again. Yeah. The other twist on it is, again, it depends where you come from. I'm dancing around too much, Luke. Well, depends where you're coming from with this. So the state government set a target, Northern Tasmanian Development Corporation set a target, and then if you get the Coordinator General come in, he'll say, well, okay, that's all fine, but we need investors. And investors are saying to him that if you've got a population group below 150,000, there's a whole suite of investors that don't find that community attractive because it's not big enough. So we're already 6,000 below that now. So the Coordinator General would say, from an investment perspective, we need a target of 200,000 by 2040, which is a 40% increase on our population. So it depends where you're coming from as to which target you would choose and why you choose that target. But if we get any of these population increases that we're talking about, we're going to challenge our infrastructure. And that's going to be a story for another day because I haven't got enough time to do that. But I guess what I'm saying, I'm just making the point that to achieve these population growth targets, we will need to look carefully at the infrastructure we provide and have available in our community so that we don't get into a situation like they've got to in Hobart, where traffic and housing affordability has become a community concern of issue. I love this though. We've either got to let more people in or we've got to have more babies, and the old bloke says we better tick A. He's not keen on having any more kids. Anyway, we've got the task force has got 14 initiatives that have been developed and are already underway. We know that aged care sector is growing. Demand for labour is there. So one of the things that we've done with the Migrant Resource Centre is support them into accessing funding to train humanitarian migrants to have skills to be able to enter that workforce. We've already got 12 people who have graduated from that course and are getting jobs. It's not going to be for everybody, but there's activity happening in that space already and success, which is fantastic. The state government has what they call their TENS program to link skilled migrants with business, because the federal government have got a policy position and they've just changed the visas so that they will encourage people to settle and work in a regional area, and if you work for 3 out of 5 years, you'll automatically be offered a permanent residency. And that's very attractive to migrants because they will come here with money, they will want to settle in Australia, and if they can just find work in a regional area, that gives them a pathway to a permanent residency in Australia. And we should take advantage of that through the TENS program and through people like Edward. The The state government's also trying to tell people a bit more about why you should come here. They've got the Make It in Tasmania program and You in a Year program. And they've just, in collaboration with the Chamber of Commerce and with Council and with City Prom, they've just launched a regional program that's focused just on Launceston. So the Chamber's been really useful in getting some of the local businesses to feature in that campaign, which is great. And we have Edward Obie. If you want to stick your hand up, Edward, just so people know who you are and can chat with you, sorry. But Edward's here with his specific target to work with Northern Tasmania Development Corporation to support the population task force and to help people, skilled migrants, find employment. So, to me, it's, let's be crystal clear. All the evidence suggests that a business as usual approach is not going to have great outcomes for our community. We need to find our lover duck, and we need to be proactive and do the things that we can to shift some of this around. And it's not just the population growth, it's those demographic changes that are sitting underneath it that are going to cause us some grief. So what can you do? You can support NTDC and Council in our initiatives and state government as well. We can commit to act regionally because we need to have a regional response to some of these things. We can support business development in the city. The more opportunities we get to grow business and jobs, the more opportunity we're going to have to grow population. We can support the UTAS redevelopment and make sure it works. We could be more open to advertise jobs and find the best candidate. And we could continue to work on making people welcome in Launceston and encouraging them to make it their home. And when someone says, look at Hobart, population growth is causing high property prices, traffic snails, can't even find a car park, the last thing we need is population growth, what the hell is the government thinking? I hope I've given you enough data and things to think about that you might challenge that, because that's another thing we have to do, is challenge the paradigm of thinking that growing a population is negative. There's some things about it that we have to do. So thank you.